Hello and welcome to this video on the data cycle. This is part of our Functional Skills Maths Level 1 and 2 course. Before we go into the video, I'd just like to add that this video is more for information than things that are tested specifically in the Functional Skills Maths exams. So this video is for background information to go alongside the data elements of the course. So the learning outcome is really to identify the terminology and the stages of the data cycle so you understand why you're doing things relative to data. So why you're drawing graphs and bar charts and working out mean, median, mode and range. The linked learning links back to our first lessons on numbers, where when we were given a group of numbers, we learned how to sort them and put them in order. The background for the data cycle and using data is that there are two things we need to understand. What is data and what do we have data for? Well, data is essentially just information. So this information could take many forms. It can be written information, it can be physical information like groups of people, or more likely in this day and age, it's going to be electronic information. The question is, why do we have data? Well, we have data specifically to answer a question. So somebody has a question that they need answering, so we collect data to answer that question. So let's have a look at this thing called the data cycle and why we use data. So the reason data exists is somebody has a question that they need answering. For example, what's the average house price for houses in Lancashire? In order to answer that question, we have to go out and collect the information. So we knock on doors, we do surveys, and we find out how much houses are worth. Then, once we've got all that data, we need to process it. So we need to add it all together and divide by the number of people we've asked. So we're working out the mean price. Or you can draw graphs or charts to show that information. And this is all part of the processing side of things. So the displays and the calculations. And then finally, we interpret our results. So we've got our processed information and we can then answer our question for our average house prices. Now, sometimes you don't get to the answer that you want straight away, and sometimes you have to go around this data cycle more than once. Now, let's look at some of the terminology that you might hear when you're using data. Again, I'm unsure whether you'll get tested on this in the exam, but let's do it just to make sure. Primary data is data that you collect yourself. In other words, you go out with your clipboard, you ask people the question, they give you the answer, and you fill out your own questionnaire. The next one is secondary data. This is where you get data from a secondary source. So instead of collecting the data yourself, you go to the internet, or you go through newspapers, or you go to the library, and you find the data you want through a secondary source. In other words, it's not your data, it comes from somewhere else. Raw data is data as it comes in. So you're not sorting it, you're not creating a tally or putting it into any kind of order. It's just like a vacuum cleaner. You're taking in all the data and you're not doing anything with it. So that's what we call raw data. Now, there are two main types of data. There's qualitative data, which is the data that comes back in words. For For example, how did you enjoy your lunch today? You could say, oh, I thought it was wonderful. It was really good. So qualitative data are words describing how people feel about things. The one we're really interested in maths is quantitative data, which is numbers. So when you had your lunch today, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10's really good, how would you rate your lunch? Well, I'd give it a 7. And then you're collecting numbers instead of words. Discrete data are set numbers. For example, how many sheep are in the field? Well, there are 10 sheep in the field. You can't say 2.4 sheep or 3.5 sheep. It's a set number. As opposed to continuous data that goes on forever, and depending on what we measure it with, depends on how accurate that information is. And the 4 things to remember for continuous data are time. So we chop time up depending on how accurate our watch is. Length, depending on what we're measuring our length with. Weight, depending on how accurate our scales are. And finally, temperature, depending on how many decimal places there are on our thermometer. That'll tell us how accurate our temperature is. The final phrase that you should really try to learn for this is data bias. And data bias is influencing our data. In other words, if we're doing our housing survey for the cost of houses in Lancashire, if we just asked people in Lytham St Anne's how much their houses were, then the average price of houses, especially in Lytham, would be very high, as opposed to somewhere else. So where we ask the question could actually bias our data. In other words, influence the outcome. The way we ask the question could also bias our data. In other words, you could say, I think Manchester United are the best team in the country. Who do you support? And then it puts pressure on people to say Manchester United. So the way the question's asked could also bias the data. So let's have a look at the first stages of our data cycle. So our data cycle starts off with a question. So somebody needs to find something out, and that question could be, what are the average house prices in a certain area? The next phase is to go out and collect the data. So we collect data by observation, in other words, standing there with a clipboard and counting the number of red cars that go past us. It could be a questionnaire where you ask people for their favorite meals. It could be an experiment where we flip a coin to find out whether it's going to land on heads or tails. Or it could be data logging, which is a computer basically collecting data on our behalf. So observation is information from the real world or the environment, like a weather station collecting temperatures every hour in a certain location. It could be a questionnaire or prompts to gather information. For example, on your course, you'll be asked how you enjoy your course on a scale of 1 to 10. Now be careful of data overlap with questionnaires. So if you have a questionnaire that asks people their ages and it says from 0 to 10 and then 10 to 20, you've got to be careful, because if somebody's 10 years old, which group do you put them in? So when you do the questionnaire, make sure that if you've got groups, that the groups don't overlap. So if somebody's 11 years old, they go in this group. If somebody's in 10 years old, they go in that group. Next is an experiment where it's a procedure to prove a hypothesis or a question. In other words, is this a fair coin? Well, you prove it's a fair coin by flipping it 50 times or 100 times. Now, the thing with an experiment is the more you do it, the better the results. So if I flip a coin twice, to see if it lands on heads the first time and tails the second time to see if it's fair is not as good as flipping a coin 1,000 times to see if it's 500 times on heads and 500 times on tails. And then finally, data login. And this is where you send something out electronically, all your answers come back electronically, and then because they're in an electronic format, you can sort them really quickly. So here we've sent out a questionnaire electronically, the data has come back, and we've put it in a spreadsheet, and we've sorted the spreadsheet by the age of our people that responded. And that goes into ascending order. So that's the question and collecting the data. Then we go round to processing the data. And the processing the data is where we're going to do a lot of this particular lesson, which is working on the displays for data. And then the next lesson, we'll look at mean, median, mode, and range. But we do this data cycle so you understand why you're drawing a display and why you're calculating a mean, median, mode, and range. The other part of the rest of these lessons are to interpret the data. So when you're given a graph or somebody tells you what a mean is, you know what it means. So can you actually make sense of the processed data in order to answer our question? And that completes the learning outcome for the data cycle, which is to identify the terminology and discuss the stages of the data cycle. The terminology that we came across is quite a lot of it, but it'll help you to understand data. Primary data is data you've collected. Secondary data comes from a source other than yourself, so somewhere like the internet. Raw data is unprocessed data as it comes in, sucked in like a vacuum cleaner. Qualitative data is words. Quantitative data is numbers, and as a mathematician we like quantitative data. Discrete data are set values, the number of students in a classroom, the number of sheep in a field, and continuous data is data that goes on forever, but we chop it off depending with what we're measuring it with. So that's time, temperature, length, and weight. Data bias means we can influence the outcome of our results with our data depending on where we collect the data or the way in which we answer the question. And there are 4 ways to collect the data: observation, questionnaire, an experiment, and data logging. And they're all buzzwords we came across in the data cycle. And that completes this video, which gives you a general understanding of data and the data cycle and why you're going to be doing the various processes in the next couple of videos. If you have any questions, please ask your tutor. I hope you've enjoyed this video.